Okay, fantastic. Okay, it looks like our recording is working, and I'm going to go ahead and pass the controls to Katy, and she will get started here.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by introducing my colleague, Sue Sherif. Do you want to say hi, Sue?
Hi, everybody. I am glad to see some familiar faces names online. And I am formerly with the Alaska State Library and now happily retired. And I was a long time ago, a teacher of children's literature at the University of Alaska. And my colleague, Katy Spangler.
Hi, I'm Katy. I'm talking to you from Eagle River, Alaska. Very recently retired professor of education at UA Southeast. So Julie asked us today to give a short webinar on selecting and evaluating children's books about Alaska in the North for your library. So these are our objectives for today. You can have a look at them. This is a tall order to do in an hour, but we're going to try really hard to give you some resources, spend a little bit of time actually evaluating the book that you brought in, and hopefully we'll be able to introduce to you something that's new, that you don't know about. So Sue's going to tell us about what is ABAK.
ABAK is a project that Katy and I and Ann Dixon, who is also, looks like, is online from Homer. Hi, Ann. And a couple of other colleagues have been working on for quite a few years to make a website that has kind of premier books about Alaska for children. And this is a recommended list. It's not exhaustive. Katy Spangler has a pretty exhaustive list of children's books about Alaska, but this was supposed to be books that are highly recommended. And you can see on the screen who the audience for it is. And on the screen also, you can see the link to it. And if Katy clicks on that link, she can show you where you can find the review form, which we're going to be talking about as we discuss criteria for evaluating Alaska children's literature. So Katy, can you do that click?
Yes, I put the link in the chat box there, and I think I just clicked on it. I think you can click on it too, and you'll find our sort of the front of our website. And just to show you a little bit about what we have in here, it's really a very simple website, and the meat of it is at the current time 50 books that we've reviewed in some depth, annotated, reviewed, and discussed the criteria that we use to include the books into this website. So let me just slides here. Oops, I'm going to go here. If you are in the website and if you look at the top paragraph that tells what it is, says who are we, and the next line says evaluation form for new titles PDF. If you could just click on that link that says PDF, you will get to our evaluation form. You can see it's several pages long. Anne Elizabeth from the Anchorage Public Library, Sue and I worked for probably a year to put together this list of criteria. We used a lot of resources that we've all used in our professional lives to come up with something that we thought was sort of succinct, in which we could evaluate the books that we want to include on our website. If you scroll through this criteria, which is on the website, and also resend it as a handout. You'll see that we have tried to divide fiction and nonfiction. We've got a section for picture books, and other criteria. The criteria we're going to be talking about mostly today is under the area called cultural appropriateness. So we'll be looking at that a little more carefully. But as you look at this website that we've got here, you're going to see that for each of the books that's on the website, you can click on, it says full review, and in the full review part, you'll be able to see this rubric filled in. And that was the bulk of our work, really taking the time to think carefully about the different books that we've included in.
And Katy, I'd like to add that we will be talking a little bit about the criteria at the bottom of the first page that have to do with the illustrations and artistry, because our examples today are picture books.
Right. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. The other thing that we want to talk about is this handout that Julie is sending to you. It's a beautiful handout that Sue made. I call it the birch leaf handout. And if you want to get that in the materials that you've got, this would be a list of, well, Sue, talk to us about what you've got in this handout.
Okay, people always want to know, where do you find books about Alaska? Because that's part of the struggle. Before you evaluate them, you have to find them, and it is a little bit hard. We've gone through periods of time when major publishers thought Alaska was really cool and signed on a lot of Alaska titles, particularly picture books. But it goes up and down as publishing fads come and go. So part of your job as youth service or public librarians is always to be on the lookout, not just for children's books, but adult books about Alaska. And so my handout, Finding Authentic Alaska Materials for Your Library Collection, has some online suggestions, online resources that you might want to steer your public to. It suggests some locations where you can find print materials, and a lot of it is detective work that you actually have to go out and do. If you have a local bookstore, you look there. If you go through the Anchorage airport in the course of your events, you go to the, what is it called, Mosquito Books. And every time I go through Anchorage, I discover new. I'm actually speaking from Fairbanks now, so where I live. But I suggest going to museums, cultural centers. Some of your school districts do original publications for children that are worth distributing in public libraries. Some of the native corporations like Sea Alaska and the Sawy Foundation down in Anchorage have some very wonderful and attractive publications. And the state and federal government, especially more for adult purposes, but occasionally they have books more on nonfiction topics that you might want to include in your children's collection. And then I have a list of links to various websites that have to do with looking for children's books on Alaska or materials on Alaska. And I'd like to point out particularly the Sea Alaska Heritage Raven books are listed there. And then if you haven't seen it, the Yukon Kayakuk School District Book Slam has some digital books that have been created by their students that are quite well done. And so you'll have the link to that in the handout. And then there is a section on authenticity. How do we figure out if things are authentic? And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on.
Okay, so you've got what we do, you've got our sources where we find our information. We've showed you our website and the evaluation form that looks like this. We've sent you, well, both on the website and by email, we're sending you a copy of this rubric. And what we thought we'd do today is just go through our thinking process on a few books that we have included in our website and how we went through the rubric. So we're going to start with the criteria of, there's two criteria actually, artistry and visual appeal. These were the questions that we asked ourselves. And Sue's going to talk to us about a great selection for these two areas.
Hi, Katy, have you advanced the PowerPoint? Because I am still seeing the handout, birch leaf handout screen.
Was doing the PowerPoint on my own computer. There we go.
There we go. So because we chose to do picture books, and this is not just Alaska books, this would be picture books in general, really the illustration criteria. But we wanted these outstanding Alaskana or youth books to meet the criteria. We have a lot of sometimes, unfortunately, self-published books and some that are kind of churned out as tourist souvenirs that really don't meet the criteria of good, high standard publishing in the world of children's literature. So, and as I read the criteria, you can read the criteria with me, but you might look at the book you have in hand if you brought a book today and just do a little mental check. So are the illustrations skillfully rendered? Do they complement and extend? Are they engaging? Is it appealing? So the example that we're using for this section is Baby in a Basket by Gloria and Ted Rand. This is not a new publication. It's from 1997 from Dutton Books, and the author is Gloria Rand, and her husband Ted Rand is the illustrator. And the title page here is kind of the traditional illustrated children's book. There's baby, there's a basket, there's a baby in a basket, and that's it. It's very very skillfully rendered, but it's static, and that's fine for a vignette like this introducing the book. But as we go through to the next slide, you can see that Ted Rand, the illustrator, has the job of portraying a family, a mother who was the first kindergarten teacher in Fairbanks back in 1917, asked to leave Fairbanks to go to Seattle in the middle of the winter in January. And she takes her 3-year-old daughter, Betty, who you can see in the left corner, and her baby, Anne, who is the baby in the basket. And how are they going? They're not taking the red eye. They're not taking, well, if one can take the ferry, one could have taken the ferry these days, or then they are going to take a freighter, but to get from Fairbanks to Valdez, you can see their means of transportation. And you can also see what January and early morning Fairbanks January would look like because of the steam coming from the horses, the general fogginess, could be ice foggy. You can see the runners on the sleigh ready to go, the precious baby being handed up, everybody swaddled in furs, and he depicts the light and the anticipation of the journey very well. And now I'm pushing N, and that, Katy, thank you. I'm trying to do it on my computer too. And then as they go along the journey, we're not seeing the complete picture book, but I wanted to show this slide because it shows a variety of perspective that Ted Rand uses. And in this case, we're seeing our sleigh from above. Our travelers look tiny in the landscape. The owl is an attracting, eye-catching feature, maybe startled by the sleigh coming through the quiet woods on the way from Fairbanks to Delta. And the The snow clumped on the trees is very much the look we have in Fairbanks these days, right now, this December. So it really is very evocative, and it shows how tiny they are, and it kind of gives an indication of their journey. I also have to give a disclaimer. You can see along the right border of the image here that is the gutter, or the space between the two pages, and there's text that's off screen right now since we're looking at illustrations. But Ted Rand has done a very skillful job, which my picture does not really show, and also the publishers have done a good job of making the illustrations meet at the gutter and go seamlessly, even though there is that seam along the middle. My photo does not do it justice, so I just wanted to point that out. And that's something to look at when you're examining a picture book critically. You want to see how those pages go together, and sometimes they're just not even in register. They're not together at all. So the trees wouldn't be coming from the stem. The next scene is a double page. This is absolutely wordless. Again, it goes seamlessly in the actual book, and in my picture, not so much. But in this, you see them meet after the kind of peaceful scene that we saw before, that they run into trouble when they're not very far out of Fairbanks, only about 100 miles away. And there goes the sled and all the occupants, and you can see the way he depicts the weather just makes you know this is not a good deal. The panic of the horses, the people with their arms akimbo as they're flying out of the sled. What will happen next? And there are no words on this page, so he's taking the task of telling the story, the story's most gripping and harrowing incident there on these two pages. So next. And then in the results, he just doesn't show everybody clumped on the ground, sprawled out, scattered out. We don't see what happens to the horses, but what we do see is, and I hope you can see it. In my projection, my head is way, but if your eye is drawn to the lower right corner, you see a very ominous sign. You see the little red knitted stocking sticking up out of the water. And indeed, Betty, the 3-year-old, has been thrown there, and you can see the panic of Mr. McNutt, the driver, as he rushes to rescue her. And the next scene is equally gripping. You're going to have to look at the book to see that this is not it. The next scene in the actual book actually shows her underwater but being rescued, and it could be quite frightening, but it was a quite frightening event. So they do rescue Betty, but the baby is nowhere to be found. And in the end, there's a happy ending, because trappers traveling along the river, these jolly guys, see a little basket blowing across the river ice, and in the basket, still cozy in her furs and her little rabbit fur hat and her tiny red mitten, is Anne, the baby. And so this is kind of it changes the tone from the horror of the accident to the happy ending. And if you could see the whole page here, you would see that underneath the skins hanging on the right, there are boots. So it looks very authentic to people who've lived in current day Alaska, the kind of gear you might see. This happens to be in a roadhouse, but this is the kind of thing that even today, if you go to a roadhouse along Richardson Highway, you might see. So Ted Rand has put so much into the illustrations that aren't strictly speaking in the text, but he also brings the action of the text through the illustrations. And that's the kind of thing you're looking for. And one thing I suggest to people is sometimes it's good to flip through a picture book without reading it first and just look at the pictures and see how much of the story you learn, and then read it through and see how the text and the illustrations complement each other. And there are always high points for an illustrator that introduces elements that follow through the story, that consistently go through the story, but aren't perhaps depicted in the text, and that takes it to true picture book art instead of just static illustration of what's in the story. So that's an examination of the criteria, artistry and visual appeal.
Okay, so we're going to move into some other elements that we consider that have to do more with the cultural part of our books. And the inclusiveness is a really important element in Alaska children's literature. One of our issues always is who's the writer? Does this person have the authority to be writing about a culture perhaps other than theirs, or maybe that person is writing in his or her own culture? One writer, Phyllis Krasilovsky, wrote the book Benny's Flag in 1960, which is the story of how our Alaska flag came to be and how Benny Benson designed the flag while he was an orphan in an orphanage in Seward. That happened in 1937, much to many people's surprise. It happened a long time before Alaska became a state. Anyway, the thing that is so evident in this lovely story, which was reprinted and illustrated by Jim Fowler more recently in the picture book that you might have in your library. If you have the old one, you're really lucky to have because it's adorable. But the new one is the one that would be in print now. The thing that we noticed in particular about this book, as far as inclusiveness, is that the fact that Benny is an Aleut boy story, it's just a fact. It's not made into anything that is exotic or unusual or different or subject of any any concern. And I think it's really remarkable that when the book was originally published in the 1960s, when there was a lot of racism and kind of pointing out cultures other than white middle class culture, that just isn't present in this book, Benny's Flag. So as far as inclusiveness, it's matter of fact. It's a lovely story about a boy and his what his accomplishment was and his contributions to Alaska. Okay, so that one got an A for inclusiveness. There's a little picture. This is actually the submission. You can see this in the Alaska State Historical Library. The kids drew these pictures on 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, kind of like printer paper. They drew them. They're either colored, or this one he colored his really nicely, and then they had to write a little piece about their flag. And the real flags that were submitted are in the Alaska State Library, and Jim Fowler used those real the real submissions in the illustrations of his book. Okay, so let's look at cultural awareness as another criteria.
Okay, there are different ways of promoting cultural awareness. In some cases, we're seeing more and more these days that the Native Alaskans or Alaska Natives are taking the production of children's literature in their own hands, and instead of having other people interpret their cultures, one thing that was rampant, and you will find even today in your libraries, is that people would take a folk tale or a traditional story from Alaska, and then without any connection to the culture, and would turn it into something that the people who actually told the story would not even recognize. And it was rankling and uncomfortable. And See, Alaska Heritage Foundation's answer was to get a huge grant from the federal government and produce a program called Baby Raven Reads. And unfortunately, you can only see half of the cover of this book, which it has a Tlingit title that unfortunately I cannot pronounce.
Here's the title, and
there's the title. But the noteworthy are the authors. These are all people who are culture bearers or members who are Tlingit themselves. And so their purpose is to create a work of high standards and high quality that will reflect their culture from their eyes instead of somebody's outside appropriation of it. And at the end, we'll show you another example from Canada where this has been done too. So that's one way of promoting cultural awareness. The next slide is about attribution. And the example that we're going to use for that both does something in the area of cultural awareness, but it also is notable because appropriate attributions are made. In other words, for instance, the folktale example, some people would say, this is from an Alaskan folktale, and they wouldn't even attribute it to the people who actually own the story or told the story originally. And some people feel, well, if it's a folktale, then it's mine to embroider in my way, even if I'm not a member of that group. When we're judging it, it's hard to know if we're not a member of the cultural group that's depicted in the story, whether the author has done a good job. Several things you can look at is the person listed as a member of the cultural group that is being depicted, then you probably feel comfortable, although even sometimes that there are disagreements within a cultural group about whether a person has told a story appropriately. A big example is Velma Wallace's book, Two Old Women, which was a very authentic tale from her area around Fort Yukon, but some people were very unhappy that she depicted it in a novel. So there can be controversy in there. We'll talk about that later on. But in this book, The Lamp, the Ice, and the Boat Called Fish, Jacqueline Briggs Martin and the illustrator Beth Cromus, who is a Caldecott Award-winning author, took a story about the Karluk expedition, which is depicted in an adult novel called The Ice Masters by Jennifer Nixon, and also older accounts by the people who were involved with this journey. It's a survival story, and the key to the survival of a ship, a wooden ship adrift at sea, it takes place in 1913, gets locked in sea ice and is dragged from the Alaska coast all the way to Wrangel Island, not our Wrangel Island, but the one north of Siberia. And the crew members who survived did very much so because there was a Nupia family along with them, and they are credited, but Jacqueline Briggs Martin makes them central to the story and the survival of this expedition and gives them their full due. So it is cultural awareness, and the way she does attribute the story to the contemporary accounts from 1913 that the survivors wrote, but she also gives credit because she did a lot of research with people in Barrow, or it was then Barrow, and the baby that's pictured on the mother's parka, his granddaughter was a consultant to Jacqueline Briggs Martin, as were other readers, including Debbie Edwardson up there. And so that gives you a feeling that she did make corrections. She was trying to be responsive and respectful of the culture that she was writing about. So that's an example of good attribution.
Cultural acceptance has to do really with the acceptance of a given work of literature by the people about whom the book was written. And we do have a negative example here. everybody's familiar with the book Julie of the Wolves. Any book that wins the Newbery Award is forever in print. This book is widely read. You know, you can see how old it is. In print, it's in every library. There are study guides about it. Everybody reads it. And in fact, my students in children's literature class have to read it. The problem with Julie of the Wolves is that, well, there's many problems. We can learn about the problems by reading reviews of Julie of the Wolves in places like American Indians in Children's Literature website that Sue has given you, or the HAIL website that is through UA Fairbanks. Many problems, including misuse of language, assumptions about people and their relationship with animals that probably weren't accurate. Unfortunately, the revered Jean Craighead George, who is a wonderful writer and an activist in many ways, she based her story, which is really very fantastic, on a short visit to her relative to Barrow. It was kind of one of those books where the person visits Alaska, has an experience, and then assumes the mantle of knowing and understanding and writes a novel about it. We have loads of books like that. Anyway, we chose not to include Julie of the Wolves because of the negative reviews about it. But I think it's important that everybody be familiar with Julie of the Wolves, and you can read about some of the issues about it and make your own decisions if you want to include it in your library recommended books, because it is in your library. I know it.
And there is a link to a review by Martha Stackhouse, who is writing from the culture, if you're interested in hearing what the specific criticisms, some of the criticisms are, and that's on the handout with the birch leaves.
So we're going to stop right there, and we asked you all to bring a book today, and we would love to have either you speak up and talk about the book you brought and one of these criteria that we've mentioned, where you might notice something about that particular book. So we would love some speakers. We have about 15 minutes to do this. If you don't feel like speaking, you can also tell us in the chat box what you're thinking about the book that you brought in. So now it's time to volunteer.
Sure, I can share with you the book I brought in here, and this is James from Kenai. I did not bring. It's not Alaskan. It is Canadian, but it's a newer book. We just received it, and I really enjoyed it, and I just wanted to share it. It's called The Pencil, and it's by Susan Avengak, I believe, and it's a really beautiful story about some folks that are in a desolate part of the Arctic, and it seems a story that's set many, many years ago, and just talking about the value of one small possession they have, a pencil. And so the mom has to leave to assist with a birth happening in town, and the father and the kids kind of just seeing what they want to do, and they find a pencil in their mom's box and end up using the pencil for writing. That being said, they are nervous that mom will react poorly because the pencil is such a valuable resource. So the story, in my take, is really something that expresses, the responsibility of the possessions you own and how to treat things that are even as we might take for granted today, as small as a pencil, but how valuable that resource is to those that don't have access to such things. And illustrations, I really enjoyed the illustrations. They're kind of cartoony, but it seems very professionally done, and I would say engaging for sure, based on as you open the the book itself, it has kind of a lined piece of paper with some very naive, childlike kind of drawings that the kids have done using the pencil. So you're intrigued. And then the title itself, the pencil, is on a lined paper that the kids end up using. The characters are all depicted in, it does appear to be kind of I'd say, I'm not sure exactly which community this is from, but definitely it seems authentic kind of clothing. And then they do use words throughout the story, and they do cite those words at the back in the glossary, such as kind of the lamp used, an oil burning lamp used, and different traditional words. That it's I believe it's an Inuit story. So some of the words are Inuit words that might talk about stone markers and a dome-shaped house made with blocks of snow, things like that. So, but anyway, yeah, the pencil is the story that I selected.
James, who is the author and the publisher of that?
Sir, it's Susan Avingok, Avinqap, and Marin Vestula, MarenVsetula. And then the publisher.
Inhabit Media, by any chance?
I'm sorry.
Inhabit Media, by any chance?
Let's take a look. It says.
It's the same authors as the book that I'm going to share in a little bit.
Published by Inhabit Media. Yes, correct.
Okay, well, good.
Yes.
We'll segue into that in a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, James. You know, the other way we all learn about new good books is through each other. Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem.
And it sounds like that book passes a number of the criteria that you that we've been talking about.
Yes, I really did enjoy it.
Thank you. Do we have someone else who'd like to share an old or new book that you brought in and you're thinking based on the criteria we've been discussing? Okay, this is, we got a text message or a chat box from Erin. Oh yeah, she's brought in one of the Sea Alaska books. So let's just take a minute to read what she wrote.
Actually, because I want to capture it on the recording, I'll go ahead and read it aloud.
Okay.
I brought in the book Let's Go by Hannah Lindoff, published by Sea Alaska Heritage. The book tells stories of families engaging in subsistence activities like berry picking and fishing. In reading it, I note that the illustrations are beautiful and dynamic. They really capture the beauty of being in natural settings. The book features words thought in Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. The end of the book features information about the author and illustrator and the clans they're from.
Thank you so much. This is another book in the great series by the Sea Alaska. Do we have anybody else who's got a book that you'd like to tell us about your thinking?
A Lucian Sparrow.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Karen Hess wrote it quite a while ago. It was a surprise when I read it to be so ignorant about that part of our history. And I've been revisiting books that I read a long time ago. And this one I listened to as an audiobook through Alaska Digital Library. And she has updated it to include an interview with one of the internees during World War II. And I thought that that was a really great touch for a kid's book.
Thanks, Felicia. You know, that book, Karen Hesse is not an Aleut person. She's not an Alaskan, but she did a beautiful job of taking the perspective of the people. It's written in kind of in different voices of the different kids who were moved from their home into the Ward Cove area near Ketchikan, and it's very well received. Under the cultural acceptance, people from, the either like Kodiak, the Aleutians, the Ketchikan area all really revere that book. It's just
Well, and I think she cranked it up a notch by including an interview with a person who was there as a young child. I think that kind of speaks to the cultural attribution where she had someone who was there be able to speak and added that onto her book.
it shows a lot of integrity, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Thanks.
and audio version. Another great one that was another surpriser to me is the new one, Fighter in Velvet Gloves.
Mhm.
You want to share with the rest of the
I just love books that I read and find out something I didn't know about in history that if somebody would have written it and it wasn't true would seem like too crazy of a story to have been believable. And it was about Elizabeth Petrovich. Is that how you say her name? Petrovich?
Petrovich.
Petrovich.
Yeah, and how Alaska passed one of the first civil rights laws because of this Native woman.
Thank you, Felicia. Yeah, I hope everybody gets that book for your library. It's really aimed more at middle school people, I think. It's not an easy read.
As a matter of fact, Katy, the Alaska State Library and the League of Women Voters of Alaska, in honor of Elizabeth Petrovich, are donating a copy to every library in Alaska. So if you haven't received it, you probably already have it in your library, but you're getting another copy of that particular title, and it's on the Battle of the Books list this year too.
That's fantastic. I was going to say it's not easy to make a children's book out of government and legislative processes, but she did a good job of making it very readable. And I think I predict that all the kids in Alaska will be reading that book before very long as part of their curriculums.
And notably, she collaborated with Elizabeth Petrovich's son in the writing of the book too. So that's another form of attribution that she mentions.
So that one's going to need. We don't have it yet on the ABAK website, but it's going to have to go on there. We have time for one more sharing. Does anybody else have a book they'd like to share or comment on? Well, if you're not sharing, at least you're thinking. Did we have somebody who wanted to mention?
This is Lori in Kodiak. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. The book, it's interesting you're talking about the Bootcheaver book because she visited us here in Kodiak, and it was quite interesting to hear the story about how she wrote the story of Elizabeth Petrovich, and I too learned a lot from her. But on another note, the book that I chose that I find interesting and really made an impact on me was The Smell of Other People's Houses by Bonnie Sue Hitchcock. The way she told the story of these 4 young Alaskan children, not all Native, and intertwined them together, I found I thought it was a realistic novel, and I've suggested it for several people who have enjoyed it as well. I thought Bonnie wrote with a good voice of the different young adults, and I liked it a lot. I was looking on the website to see if it had been evaluated yet, but the link didn't open, so I don't know.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Sue and I each brought in a couple or one new book that, like you're doing now, that we wanted to share that we haven't evaluated yet for the website. But Sue?
Okay, my selection is the 2019 publication by Paul Gracie, who happens to be from Fairbanks, and you may know him as the author of Surviving Bear Island, which is a middle school survival story. But the one I picked to talk about is The Wildlands, which is just an astonishing survival story of teenage Travis and his 10-year-old sister Jess, who make their way in a future interior Alaska that has been decimated by natural disasters. It's a time when the oil has run out. The pipeline has been dismantled. Fires, both natural and human set, have decimated large swaths of the interior, and the living is rough and cutthroat. The federal government has given up on Alaska and doesn't support it anymore. And so people are living a hard scrabble life. And after their parents died, the two set out to go south to the south coast to hopefully make connection with civilization, because there's no telecommunication. They have no way of knowing what's going on in the outside world, or how they will survive in the very chaotic remnants of society that remain in interior Alaska. And so Travis and Jess meet people, both good and bad, along the way. And Paul has lived here for 30 years and has hiked many, many inches of Alaska. So his depiction of walking through the scarred interior of Alaska and the dangers that these two and some of their traveling companions face is very authentic. And it's a gripping story. Every chapter practically has a cliffhanger ending. It's a compelling read, and it's for older teenagers. And it's despite the bleak landscape, and it has just a wonderful humanity to the characters of Travis, Jess, and their friends. Their loyalty, their courage, and their persistence is quite amazing. So that's my recommendation.
So exciting when people who are Alaskans are creating really high level literature. And we have not spoken about some of those other people, not to, but when you look at ABAK, I think you'll be able to find some other really fine Alaska writers. One of them, Ann Dixon, is right here with us today. I have been very impressed by Barbara Atwater's book, How Raven Got His Crooked Nose, where she took a Dena'ina tale and tells it in an authentic way and beautifully illustrated by Mindy Dwyer, who lived in Alaska for a long time. She and her son have written these books, and a new one is supposed to be out in April of 2020. Of course, I haven't looked at it yet, but this would be one that you'd really want to keep your eyes out for. And again, Sue had mentioned earlier that we have this problem where people from outside of the culture will rewrite a folktale kind of in a Western way, and these would be told in a more traditional way. Earlier, let's see, who was it? David mentioned the book The Pencil, and I had picked out this book as another one I wanted to recommend to you, Fishing with Grandma, by the same author. I just love this. You know, David said kind of cartoony illustrations, and that's exactly true of this book. But it's just a simple story of a grandmother taking the two kids out ice fishing. And what impressed me so much about its authenticity was that in the end, the little girl catches a fish and they give pieces of it to other older people in the community, and then they bring home what's left of the fish to cook for themselves. So that value of sharing with each other was such an important part of the book. Sue and I both really esteem these Canadian books. They're the Inhabit, and then other publishers too are publishing a lot of children's books with accurate Indigenous content. So there's a handout for that in the stuff that Julie is sending you with some other ideas for Canadian books. I have to say that whenever I go to Whitehorse, I stop in at Fireweed Books there, And I usually come out with about 30 or 40 books because it's a great place and it's, you know, kind of nearby where you can really take a look at their books with Indigenous content.
Yes, and also on your list, not quite in the same vein as Inhabit Media or See Alaska Heritage Foundation, but the Eagle Crest books publishers that are listed do books that are from that have settings in northern BC and the Yukon Territory. So they are very similar and culturally similar in some cases to the people and places of interior Alaska, and they're not great literature, but they are easy readers, but they have settings that children in some parts of Alaska can identify that are rarely depicted in children's book. The Arctic gets a lot of coverage and Southeast Alaska gets a certain amount of coverage, but interior Alaska is a little less loved by publishers. So you might look at those Eagle Crest books if you need things for first and second grade readers and kind of a nonfiction.
There's a lot of stuff out there, really. It's amazing how many books there are with northern content. And both Sue and I have this, you know, we don't just look at Alaska. We look at books with northern content, indigenous, and, you know, kind of landscape types of content. Okay, for the last part here, we're just going to talk about the future. I would like to invite anybody who's interested to join in some longer term classes on children's literature that focuses on Alaskan children's and young adult books. I teach 2 classes. One of them is an online class that's offered in the spring and summer semesters. We meet on Monday afternoons. It's a book for, or excuse me, it's a class for upper division undergraduates. And it's a pretty good survey of what's out there in Alaska children's literature. And anytime I get librarians who join that class, I make some adjustments for you so that it's relevant to your work. We also do another graduate class in Alaska children's literature that again is somewhat of a survey, but it's as in graduate school, it's in more depth. And the centerpiece of it is a week in Juneau in the Egan Library, where we have a very good comprehensive Alaska children's collection. And then we also use the Alaska State Library collection. So I invite any of you to join me in those classes. And then there's Alaska Books for Alaska Kids.
And I would like to invite any or all of you to look at the form that's on the website and that you have been sent, and think about joining us as a reviewer. There have been 4 of us working for a good number of years, and when you look at our website, it has a limited number of titles, and we know that every day we're finding out about more. For instance, the See Alaska Heritage and the Inhabit Media books are not up there yet, and we could really use the help. We would love to invite you to become reviewers. There's I believe there are instructions out on the site to tell you how to submit your reviews, and we would really love to widen our review field. And the more people and the more parts of Alaska that we have, the better. Just to give you one quick example before we sign up, I remember back in the 80s or early 90s, there was a book called Hannah's Alaska, and it was reviewed for School Library Journal by somebody in Southeast Alaska, and she said that, oh, it was a nice story, but it really couldn't, the person didn't know anything about Alaska because it was set in Fairbanks and the children were out in the wintertime waiting for the bus in tennis shoes. And that unfortunately showed that the reviewer didn't know too much, because physiologically, it should not be possible to stand out in sub-zero weather with tennis shoes on, waiting for the bus. But that's at that time period, that's what kids did. And so the illustrator did capture an authentic look that wasn't recognized by somebody in Southeast. And we have such a big state with so many cultures, so much geographic variety. The more people we have from the more sections of the state, the better our website is going to be and the better service we can provide to other people. We hope people from outside look at it so that they will be going for authentic things as well as our libraries here in state.
Okay, and this is Julie. I just want to remind everyone, if you didn't receive the 3 handouts, you can always email me and I will send it to you after the fact. We also will be posting this webinar on our archived webinars webpage, and I will send out a notice because so many people told me that they were unable to attend this webinar today because they had other going on. I'll send that out on the ACLA list as well. So Katy, before we go, if you could hand me back the presenter, just change your, click on my name again.
I clicked on your name.
Okay, great.
I just want to say I'm so thrilled that so many of you called in, and maybe we'll be listening to this later, and that you're interested in this wonderful area of children's books about Alaska, because it is so exciting and so much fun, and we're glad to have other people interested too.
Right,
Yes.
and I just want to thank Roz because Roz Goodman has contacted me a couple times and suggested this very topic. And Roz, thank you for your persistence. And I just want to encourage all of you, if there's a topic of concern that you would like to have a webinar on, please let me know and I will do my best to find presenters who are experts on that topic. Because if you're interested in it, as we can see, probably a lot of other people are as well. So thanks everybody for coming today. And again,
And
thanks so much
Julie?
Drew and Katy. Yes?
Before we sign off, I would like to thank you for organizing this and inviting Katy and me. We obviously could talk about this for much longer, but maybe someday we can do a part 2 and maybe involve some of the people who've signed up to be reviewers.
All right, absolutely. I'm up for that. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to stop the recording and thank you very much. And if you have any questions, should we let them see if there's any questions before we close?
Sure.
Any questions before we go here? Just check in the box here. Okay. All right, well then I'm going to stop the recording and thanks everybody. Oh, somebody said, can I mention my occasional blog? Absolutely. Anne, do you have a mic? She says, can I mention my occasional blog? It's called kidlitnorth.blogspot.com. Absolutely. Anne, if you have a mic and would like to share, go ahead. Oh, her mic's not working. Okay. So everybody, kidlitnorth.blogspot.com.
We miss you, Anne. Welcome back.
Okay. All right, she says I'm here. Okay. All right, well, we're going to stop the recording and thanks everybody and have a wonderful, wonderful day.